Donc, nous pouvons commencer. Well, it's very hard for me to be able to speak French, to not be able to speak French in this residency, but I will try today and to help our interpreter friends. So I'd like to say, first of all, that I'm very happy that we can have this event here on the issue of Europe's defense, how we're going to organize ourselves, and how we are going to, of course, we're very sensitive to the current events. So, of course, we've all seen the atrocities and the horrors, in particular in the town of Bucha, and which is on our continent. I'd like to remind you of this. I'd like to remind you how security is a pressing issue and is something that we need to cherish and defend. And there are experts who will be able to speak much more in detail on the issues that we're going to speak about today. And basically, what I know today is, with regard to the events, is that there's an acceleration of the awareness that defense of our way of living requires to be preserved and guaranteed. We have had the discussion, and the discussion has intensified, and France has played its role in this discussion by maintaining, first at the national level, a high investment in defense and calling for years for Europe to have sufficient defense capabilities. And so in order to defend ourselves, there are two things that we need. First is the ability to do so and to have sufficient budget, to have sufficient equipment, to have armies that are sufficiently trained and ready. And from this point of view, the discussion, of course, is accelerating in intensity. We all need 100 billion euros is a very important figure, and I'm very impressed by how this discussion has accelerated. Even before the war in Ukraine, the defense budget was at around 1.85%, and is to bring it up to 2% of the GDP. And seeing the Netherlands following the same course, of course, is an important signal. It's the fifth economy of the European Union, so the Netherlands is willing and able to act. That's the second element of our collective awareness. We are aware of the necessity to accept that sometimes it's necessary to use force to defend our interests and to be able to support and withstand the pressure by those who wish to threaten us. And I've seen a very clear development in our mentalities that we can see in the decision to export weapons to Ukraine, which in fact in itself is a very important development. But I also see that we were able to count on the Netherlands to be involved when it was necessary, when the European security stakes were threatened. This was true in the Sahel. This will also be true in NATO's presence in Eastern Europe. Our Dutch friends are already present in Lithuania. In Germany, we're present in Estonia. And tomorrow, I hope that together they will be deployed in Romania in our reinsurance policy for our European allies. So we see that things change very quickly, are developing very quickly. And this is maybe the last element that I'd like to share with you. Everyone is also reviewing his way of thinking about these issues. When I arrived in the Netherlands, I was told that there's one word that you shouldn't say, or two words you shouldn't say, strategic autonomy. You should never say it. That's what I was told. Never speak about strategic autonomy. It would seem to be completely unacceptable. But in fact, it was curious because I was told they were speaking about European sovereignty, which seems much more ambitious, but I couldn't speak about strategic autonomy for some reason. And 2 years later, I see that we are discussing strategic autonomy with Spain, for example, and I see that this issue appear over and over again. So you see things are changing quickly once again. Personally speaking, and no Frenchman has ever doubted our commitment. I'm trying to warm up the room to make sure that we brew up a bit of enthusiasm. I spoke about our commitment and we have in France always been committed allies in the framework of NATO. And today, I think we're reaching a level of commitment that's extremely high because of the Ukrainian crisis. And I spoke about the increase of our presence in Estonia, exercises in Norway recently, and deployment in Romania as well. So each one is taking on his responsibilities within the available frameworks, and that's what's really nice to see. It's nice to see that each one is contributing to the security of our continent, which is more necessary than ever. And the fact that the room is full today, and that everyone therefore is aware that defense issues are extremely essential. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, and in particular our friend Clingendael for having organized this event. And I will give them the floor right away. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Oui. OK. Merci Ambassadeur Vassy pour votre introduction.
Which was very interesting, of course, and thank you very much for your hospitality at the French residence here. And we have organized a conference with the French embassy, and I'd like to thank them for their cooperation.
We will now proceed with our panel. I'm grateful for having all the panel members present, including Ambassadeur Domenach, qui est arrivé. To my right, the French permanent representative to NATO. To her right, to your left, is Mr. Rob Postma, the CEO of Airbus Defence and Space Netherlands. And to the far right, far left for the audience, is my, if I may say, good friend Klaus Schumann from the EU military staff in Brussels. And to my left, the first is Jaap Werner, the PSC ambassador of the Netherlands Political and Security Committee, for those who are aware what acronym stands for, or POPS in French. Acronym. And to the far left, Lars Walraven, Director International Affairs of the Director General for Defense Policy of the Ministry of Defense in The Hague, and he is replacing Joep Wijnands, the Director General, who cannot be here this afternoon, and I'm very grateful to Lars that he was prepared to step in. Welcome to all of you, the audience, and also those who are listening or watching on the live stream. Before introducing the theme of this afternoon, let me remind the panel members and also the audience that we have a public event here. That means that whatever you say can be quoted. So it is not under the Chatham House rule. Let's then jump on the content. According to a Chinese proverb, we are living in interesting times, but I believe we can now multiply this to very, 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 very interesting times, but also to very worrying times. And of course, I refer to the ongoing war in Ukraine. Now in its 6th week, after the start of the Russian invasion. And this is shaking the European security order and is raising fundamental questions about the future of security in Europe. It is therefore also raising key questions about the future and tasks, roles and tasks of both NATO and the EU. At a time when both organizations are reviewing their strategies. The EU has just agreed the EU strategic compass, and NATO is preparing a new strategic concept to be approved at the NATO summit in Madrid in June later this year. Many questions can be asked about how both organizations should respond to the Ukraine crisis, such as the future policy towards Russia, which has been based on the combination of deterrence and dialogue since the Harmel report was adopted in the 1960s, the late 1960s. Is this dual-track approach to Russia still possible? Is it still desirable? What about NATO's core tasks? Article 5, collective defense, is likely to get even more emphasis than it is already today. Is the non-Article 5 task of crisis management watered down by NATO in the future? Or should this perhaps be predominantly led by the EU, which is now also developing, after the adoption of the strategic compass, the EU rapid deployment capacity? And what is defense in the 2020s and beyond? The Ukraine war looks at first glance like a very classical form of warfare. Tanks, artillery, and infantry. But we live day to day now in another environment and under constant threat, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, interference through the social media, and last but not least, new weapons, such as the tool of migration, which we have seen a couple of times being used by some countries, or energy, gas dependency, and what to do about that. So let's hear what the distinguished panel members have to say on all of this. Each of them will have about 7 minutes to deliver an initial statement. And after completion of the introductions, I will then ask a few questions, which are my prerogative as a moderator, and then I will open the debate to the audience here in the residence. The panel debate will be conducted in English, but I understand, Ambassador Domenach, that you will speak in French during your initial statement, but the discussions then will be conducted in English. Ambassador Domenach, the war in Ukraine is already having a major impact on NATO, taking into account the reinforcement measures that have been taken to strengthen deterrence in Eastern Europe, in the Eastern European countries. I think there are now about 40,000 troops under NATO command in the Eastern European NATO member states. But the war, of course, will also have an enormous impact on the discussions on NATO's strategic concept. Up to the Madrid summer in June this year, as already said. So we are very curious to hear your views on the matter. Et vous avez la parole.
Merci Dick et merci.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you everyone for this invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this exchange. I'm sorry I arrived a little bit late. I came immediately from a NATO meeting. We have a meeting of the foreign ministers the day after tomorrow. All the countries of NATO. And I have to say, actually, that we have meetings practically every week since early January. In this crisis, which we anticipated and which we feared, but we were, however, not able to prevent, and which led to a very unified response from the whole NATO community. However, it is a true shift which is brought about by this return of war to Europe. Today is the is the anniversary of the signature of the NATO treaty, 4th of April 1949, so 73 years old today. And the first lesson of NATO, I got it from a Dutch diplomat. It was a Dutch diplomat who was going to retire. I was a very young diplomat and I was doing my NATO tour, as it is called. I think I was the first French diplomat to do this tour, and this general speaking of the result of Srebrenica and all the questionings brought about by this said to me, look, for me, NATO is the guarantee of security, thanks to which my country lived free, prosperous, with measured defense security and with the guarantee that there will be no more war in Europe. And I never forgot this lesson because, of course, I have a very different perspective in which the idea to rely on a third country to ensure our security or even to make sure that there wouldn't be one Europe, that wasn't evident for me. However, I never forgot this lesson. The conclusion of the general who told me when I was an adolescent, I protested in Amsterdam against the Vietnam War. And I think it's important, especially when you're French, to understand what NATO represents for other people and to understand that we're collectively in this situation. And naturally, we're all now collectively flabbergasted by the return of war in Europe. It is a huge upheaval for everyone, and we will have to draw the conclusions in the framework of the strategic concept, which we will discuss in Madrid at the next NATO summit. Now, about the questions that you asked, Dick. First of all, the question of recentering ourselves on the collective defense of the Euro-Atlantic zone. Now, you know, we have this document from 2017. Okay, first of all, the purpose of being is collective defense, crisis management. Now, following the failure in Afghanistan led to the accelerated withdrawal of the troops. Naturally, the debate has focused on recentering on our collective defense. And of course, with the developments in Ukraine, it is clear that this is the first question. So I can say that France has the same perception, this idea of the alliance, and that its priority is collective defense and refocusing on this Euro-Atlantic zone. And this is really quite coherent with a certain way of perceiving NATO in France. However, at the same time, we have to think of the whole diversity of the threats and the challenges that we have to face. I'm not sure about the Dutch public, but I know that people on the street in France, you know, the terrorist threat, even now, is still probably at the top of the threats that would be listed. So how to struggle against terrorism? We know that every time that we have become distracted, they pop up everywhere. So this terrorist threat must remain a priority for us. The question is, how can we adapt our way of fighting against terrorism? So in answer to your question, collective defense, yes, and actually refocusing on the collective defense, but while also keeping terrorism as one of the priorities. And maybe reformulate the struggle against terrorism. And so this naturally brings up the whole question of defense capacity, because we need sufficient capacity for collective defense, but also agile enough so that it can be applied to other purposes. Now, with this priority about the collective defense, we see concepts of the Cold War coming back, such as the forward defense. I do not want to speak for other people, but this is also a concept formalized by the Germans. And I think that we have to have a sincere discussion between different NATO members on what this concept meant during the Cold War and what it did not mean. You know, the defense of the alliance during the Cold War, well, the reality is that in spite of certain expectations, the defense line was actually on the Rhine, the most advanced line of the alliance. So what does this mean in terms of the positioning of the forces? And how ready are we to mobilize forces which would be deployed, on what rotation principle? I think we all agree that the act between NATO and Russia in 1997 must in no way prevent deployment on the oriental flank. However, we do have a capacity challenge to see how permanent this can be. Now we're sort of thinking about volumes, a reminiscent of the Cold War. We had 300,000 on both sides. And so we really have to have this discussion on our capacities. What is the suitability of this setup? Are the Americans ready to do this? Well, they also have priorities. As you know, France has taken a first role in terms of the reinforcement of the deployments on the oriental flank. We have a map of the French reinforcements here. You see on the oriental front, so Eastern Front. I wanted to point out that the specificity of our engagement is that it was agreed very early on, 19th of January, by Emmanuel Macron, when we were still speaking to Putin. On the 19th of January, we said that France was prepared to take on a key role in Romania. We have 500 French soldiers who have now been joined by Belgians. And they're working in some framework with the Netherlands also. So we also have reinforcements of in Estonia, next to the British. We've just deployed 3,000 soldiers in Norway. We have deployed about 100 flyers in Estonia, in Poland, as soon as the offensive started. And also from we cover the skies of Romania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Croatia from the Charles de Gaulle ship. So I just wanted to show you this map because it is important of the eastern flank, and I wanted to tell you how much we see this contribution to the eastern flank as a complementary to the efforts that are being made by the European Union. So all of this to tell you how much we are thinking about the cohesion between the EU and NATO. For us, it is clear that Europeans must invest more in this security. So there's going to be more spending. I'm sure we'll speak about this more. We don't want to be, fetishists about the 2% in France. So we have a sort of a well-known secret. In France, there's certain obvious expenses that we don't include in the 2%. So we're a bit proud of it, that we're not just aiming just for that 2% exactly. So at the summit in Versailles, we really pushed so that Europeans, like the Netherlands, would have a more important defense engagement, and that these countries really move towards cooperative projects together with other members of the European Union. Naturally, the German announcements have been very key, and this is a very powerful motor for others to act. Another important element in terms of increased defense by Europeans is, well, to work on a win-win situation. So and by that I mean, the more the European Union does, we don't at all agree that the more the EU does and the more this will be harmful for NATO. No. We really have to get out of this old idea from the past. I noticed that in Paris we have set this idea apart. And of course, there were certain concerns in Paris to really make sure that European defense was really appreciated. I think now today everybody is convinced that European defense is developed within the framework of the EU, but also, for instance, in other mechanisms like NATO. So it's not like more or less NATO. It is really, the question is who wants to do more for European security and who, for different reasons, doesn't see the point of this. Now, I just want to come back on this last point, the question of China. because I think that this will, of course, come up during the strategic concept work. So this Chinese challenge, in hybrid spaces, cyber security, that's on one side. And then there are also external dangers that are outside of the Euro-Atlantic zone. And I think we have to be clear, NATO is not going to become the Asia-Pacific mechanism. It doesn't have the mission to guarantee the security of countries outside of the Euro-Atlantic zone. And so I think in order to remain credible, you mustn't get everything mixed up. However, it is obvious that China raises certain security questions for the Euro-Atlantic zone. I just wanted to conclude on the necessity, when we think about the strategic concept of Madrid, to make sure that we write the collective security of NATO. This has to be in the framework of an international order based on rules-based. So, naturally, I also support an approach based on values, but I think that if we want to avoid that this work in Madrid be seen as the West against the rest, we have to speak not only to the converted, but we have to be very demanding amongst to one another within the alliance. But I also think that we have to speak to the world, explain to them we're not a fortress, we are an alliance that respects rules, the rule of law, and that is in the interest of other people, other than Westerners, to respect these rules too. Thank you.
All the way from collective defense to China, and in between a little map showing the French deployment. So thank you very much. There is something in your introduction we can come back to later on, I think. But that's for later. Let's now move from NATO headquarters and the French representation to the Dutch representation at the Political and Security Committee to Ambassador Jaap Werner. The EU strategic compass has been approved, agreed. I'm not sure what the exact language is. I think it was agreed in the conclusions. And now, of course, there is the enormous challenge of implementing the concept. I think agreeing the concept was already an enormous event, which took about 2 years, year and a half. But now, of course, it's the implementation that is posing very, very serious questions. 2 member states in particular, and you are a representative of one of the member states, but also from your Brussels perspectives, I'm very interested, and I suppose all the audience is interested in how you see the implementation taking place and rolling in the next few years. So you have the floor.
Is this on? Yes, it is. Okay. D'abord, un grand merci à l'ambassade de France, monsieur l'ambassadeur.
Big thank you to the French ambassador for having organized this meeting, to have made it possible to have this debate, which is an urgent debate and also important. I feel very privileged to be here today with you.
On the security compass, strategic compass. Let me give you a few remarks to focus the mind for the discussion. First of all, I want to say a few words on what the compass is and what it isn't. It's always good to have a good understanding on the scope and width of it. And then let me say a few words about implementation and how to go from here. First of all, it's the strategic compass is a 47-page document that indeed was adopted by the Council of Ministers of the European Union on the 23rd of March, or the 21st of March, I believe. So the previous council, after about 1.5 years of preparation and about 4 or 5 months of negotiations. It comprises 5 chapters. The first one is the world we face, which is basically a political assessment of where we are as Europe, facing threats and challenges. Basically, the starting point is that Europe and European Union faces dangers that we should come to grip with. So that's the first chapter. It's a political analysis of threats and challenges. The second one is the chapter called ACT. It means what are we going to do about this? It contains an element of prepare, how we prepare to act, and it particularly focus on the rapid deployment capacity that Dick already mentioned in his introduction. That obviously is the core of our act, of how we want to be able to move in the world. And there is a chapter on secure, which is basically about the resilience of the European Union. And it talks about the new challenges, including hybrid challenges and cyberspace. It also speaks about stronger cooperation in, for instance, the intelligence arena. It has a chapter on invest, which means spending more. The ambassador already mentioned the circumstances by which governments in Europe now increase their defense spending. It speaks about what to spend it on, how to plan it, and also about the strategic enablers, which is something that will give the European Union the certain capacity to act by themselves. And then the final chapter is on partners. And obviously, NATO is the sort of privileged partner of the European Union in security matters. It goes without saying, and Lars, my neighbor here, will speak more about how we see the partnerships. This is what roughly the strategic compass is about. What it is not, it's not the end. It's not. This is not now on a shelf to gain dust. It's the beginning of a process of implementation, of negotiations towards implementation, and to get. It's a tasking. It's a list with things to do. It's not a menu, in my view. You might call it a roadmap or a feuille de route, or not a menu, because it would be à la carte, sort of. We do this, yes, we do this, but we don't do the other things. It's not à la carte. We'd have to do it all. If we want to be credible as an EU in the security and defense space, we have to do it all. So I see it as a recipe for organic growth of the European security and defense identity. And the strong point of the European Union, in my view, always has been since its inception in the 1950s, it's its capacity for organic growth, which means we grow step by step. And when we have a crisis, we grow a little bit harder, a little bit faster. And this is also what I see happening now here with the security and defense identity. You should bear in mind that the European Union obviously started as an economic integration project, and that the security dimension came much later, which is the political cooperation. Maybe, what was it, the 1980s, 1990s? And then we had the defense cooperation, which started between the French and the British in the Saint-Malo Declaration in the around 2000, which is only 20 years ago. And I see the strategic compass as sort of the a big step towards a stronger European security and defense identity, an important milestone and a hallmark in that sense. Finally, what it is not, it came about a month after the Russian invasion into Ukraine, so it's not the European answer to the Russian invasion. As Dick rightly mentioned, we've been working on this for about 1.5 years in different phases of preparation and negotiation. The response to the Russian invasion, we can talk about that later, perhaps, is mostly economical, because the European Union obviously has economic instruments that really make a difference, whereas in the security and defense domain, this is exactly still a growing thing. So what the compass achieves to be is to develop the European Union as a security provider for its member states and for its neighbors, with a degree of strategic autonomy there in place. Indeed, as the ambassador mentioned, there was a long stretch, maybe only a few years ago, but now we seem to want this all. The Russian invasion did catalyze a number of elements of the negotiations. Obviously, the language on Russia is much stronger than it was 2 months ago. In fact, there were a number of member states 2 months ago that were not as ready as they are now to call Russia a direct threat to our interests. And now, obviously, that language is now as it should be, and the sense of urgency on defense investments has become much higher. The burden of proof is no longer on those who increase their defense budgets on the country, I would say. At the same time, the compass has kept its 5 to 10 years focus. So it's a development tasking. It's not expected to be ready next year. It will take time, and again, it's all through building the blocks and organic growth that we will get there. Hopefully, with a stronger, no doubt, with a stronger sense of urgency. So, for the implementation of the compass, it's key that all member states are and remain committed. Let me stress how important it has been that we've had a thorough and participatory process to get to that final version of the compass. And I hope and I think that member states will stay committed to the compass because of the inclusive process that has led to it. In fact, all member states have in the early stages of the compass have contributed to it by non-papers, by think tank seminars and what have you, on the basis of which the European External Action Service has provided the first draft. So there also France, but also the Netherlands played an active role in promoting ideas that we thought were important to take on board of the compass. So a compliment here to the External Action Service and the French Presidency for their role in these, especially in the final months. So the External Action Service and the Military Committee will play a coordinating role by monitoring the implementation of the compass, the next phase. This is key since it is important to keep track of the progress made and the commitments to be fulfilled. And as I said, implementation is dependent on the commitment of the member states. And I can highlight a few points on what the Netherlands is going to do. Firstly, we will fully support the rapid deployment capacity. In that vein, the Netherlands will contribute to the German-led RDC in 2025. Secondly, we will increase our contribution to EU missions and operations. We're currently looking into ways to do so and to which missions and operations we can contribute more. In fact, we have a fairly poor track record as far as the Dutch participation in EU missions is concerned. Thirdly, the EU needs to play an important role in countering hybrid threats in a coordinated manner. The EU has many instruments at its disposal which can be used in a more integrated manner to counter hybrid threats. To this end, we proposed in the early phases already the setup of an EU hybrid toolbox together with Finland and Denmark, and we're happy that this proposal was adopted in the strategic compass, and we remain committed to develop this further and implement this toolbox as soon as possible. Finally, I'd like to mention that the call for more investments in defense, Lars can perhaps say more about that, but we are looking, aren't we, at a defense spending increase by 25%, and looking actually at options for possible further increases. And we intend to do more about collaborative capability development initiatives. In fact, these have not been growing so much recently, but now we will invest more in our cooperation with Belgium, for instance, the Belgian and Dutch Air Forces training together, operating together, and the integration of our two navies. And also you could think about the Netherlands-German Corps, Army Corps, obviously, that we will further intensify. So finally, joint capability development initiatives will be key to the success of the Strategic Compass now that we move from paper to practice. Back to you, Dick.
Jaap, I think you already gave some food for thought and some hints for Lars later on to elaborate on the Dutch position and what the Netherlands will do in the near future. But first, let's stay in Brussels and move to the military voice. Lars, the EU has set targets in the past. We had the Helsinki headline goal. We had the EU battle groups, which perhaps were a good tool for capability development, but of course never deployed. And now we have something new, which is called the rapid deployment capacity. What I find intriguing, emphasis that it should also include the air and the maritime. But I think it's more clearly stated now. And what is also intriguing is that all the strong force, which can be deployed in any circumstances, if I read the compass well, also in circumstances which are not very, very benign. So I will be very interested from your military point of view, how you see this capacity to reality. The target is set 2025, it should be operational, deployable. There will be exercises along the road, concepts, scenarios, like a high-speed track. So I wish you very good luck with that. But I'd like to hear your views on how this can be realized. Is this all realistic?
Yeah, thanks very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Mr. Ambassador, thanks very much for inviting me, and also Dick. It's a pleasure to be with you here today, and indeed, it's for us now to implement this rapid deployment capacity, which is quite an important task and also a challenging task. As I think personally that we still have to create something like a real common understanding what it is in the end. I think it is clear that it is not a standing force. It has been said several times that it is a capacity and not a force. So the first thing is then, what are we deploying in the end, if not the capacity? So there needs to be something like a force in the end. And it is now our task to work on this implementation. But of course, this is not the only task the military has received. So there's a lot to do in parallel for us. And we hope that in the end, those things, and we are quite confident that it will be like this, feed into each other. There are several tasks and work strands which feed into that, and also hybrid has, for example, been mentioned, space has been mentioned, the airspace has been mentioned, and we are working on that. And this is, to a certain extent, at least from a military perspective, that is quite new, and we have to work and think a lot about it. So the RDC is one of the main deliverables. I think in the discussions after the adoption, there was also a kind of ambiguity in the, let's say, in the statements. I mean, that was at the beginning of the Ukraine war, And the RDC was several times also put into connection of Ukraine, although of course the idea of the RDC is much older than this conflict, this war. And I would argue that the initial idea of the RDC is clearly to deploy it in the context of CSDP rather than in the context of any kind of, let's say, territorial defense. Yeah, and my understanding is, of course, it will remain in the context of the RDC. But having said that, and Ms. Ambassador, you have stated that already, I think that the RDC in any case needs to be, well, the EU actions need to be thought in combination, linked to what NATO is currently doing. And that is, I think, quite clear, at least for all member states, which are also NATO allies, that we cannot develop the RDC, so to speak, in isolation. So somehow, I think we also need to consider how the RDC links to VJTF, to NIF constructs, and how can we organize that in a way that those member states don't have a kind of double burden, and that there is no real duplication in the end. Yeah, so somehow there need to be a linkage in the end. So of course we have done our initial analysis of the RDC. It is still work in progress, and at the very beginning it is for us now, of course, on the level also of the military representatives and the CHOTS in the military committee, to further discuss how the modules which are mentioned in the strategic compass, the air, maritime, land, but also cyber and space modules, are linked to the battle groups, the modified battle groups. Also that is work in progress. How, which kind of enablers are needed, and how this all can be put together in a way that it is really rapidly deployable without being a standing force. Yeah? And that is a challenge. Yeah? So live access exercises in general playing a big role there, I would say, in order to assure the interoperability between this modules, and that is one of our main works currently. But of course, there is much more. There are a lot of new elements in it. So I already referred to the live access, which never have been taken place in a EU context. But also here, we need to know, we need to see how we can build also on national exercises, how we can build on maybe even NATO exercises, how we can combine that also there in order to limit the additional efforts for the member states. C2 arrangements is a very important question, I think, and from a military perspective, I would say there is quite a huge value in taking the MPCC forward, to have something. This would be then standing in Brussels as a C2 element that has a certain, which is there, yeah, and doesn't need to stand up, and also can support in planning and conducting the exercises. So everything can be put together quite early in the planning phase. Yeah? But there are also two more political elements I would like to highlight. I think where we have to discuss further And this is also already stated in the strategic compass. The first is the decision-making mechanism. Yeah, there is no sense in having rapidly deployable forces which are expensive and then not being in a position to take the decisions quickly enough. And the second one is the funding. I think that we have already made a significant step with the EPF, but I personally think we need to go further there, and we need to share the burden, so that is not only on the shoulders of those who are deploying and contributing with forces. And maybe as a very last point, that is also something which is not closely related to the deployment capacity, but something we need to keep in mind as well. And this is the follow-on forces. I think a good reason that we never have deployed the battle groups, there are a lot of reasons, but one reason is also that it was, we don't had any exit strategy for the battle groups, so that it was not clear what is coming then. And the rapid deployment capacity, I would say, is even more ambitious, and we need to think about when we doing our operational planning, the advanced planning, what could be a possibility for the follow-on forces, and then we are back also at the headline goal in the end, yeah, and the Helsinki headline goal. So I leave it with that. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I noted down at least 6 points, which will need considerable consultation with member states and watering down, I think, and narrowing down what the EU rapid deployment capacity exactly means and what is needed. But that is perhaps later for the discussion. Let's then move to The Hague. We are in The Hague, but I mean, of course, political and defense The Hague, to Lars Walraven. Lars, the Dutch defense policy, or the security and defense policy, since a couple of years is based on what is called the and approach. Both NATO and the EU play an important role in Europe's security and defense. But with the Ukraine war, this is raising, of course, important questions, because what we will see, I think, and Ambassador Domenach already pointed to that, is a further strengthening of the collective defense effort of NATO, deterrence and defense posture. And that may contradict the EU's ambitions, I think, with the EU rapid deployment capacity in terms of its original purpose, CSDP, crisis management. But perhaps I'm making a conclusion a little bit too fast, and I leave it to you to explain how this can be combined.
First of all, I would, as Nick already introduced me, say a few words on end-to-end, but not thanking the Ambassador for both organizing and hosting this, I think, very timely event. Together was this timely. And basically, we have to strive for both a strong EU and a strong NATO. So I'm also very happy with what Lars already said about the relation, for example, between the EU, RDC, and NATO, and how to work this out. For our security, we'll need both organizations of security. In this regard, the Dutch security policy has evolved in the last couple of years. It had introduced NATO with its support of the EU defense was more in the margins of its existing methodology. It was at the MRDA was more than 7 years the NATO indoctrination. It takes some time to get this within our ministry, I can tell you. But this has changed. NATO remains the broad organization for national defense and deterrence. At the same time, stronger EU defense policy is also high on the agenda at the moment.
I hope this works better. Will I start over or was I loud enough? I will continue. Afterwards, you come to me if you missed something. The EU defense policy is high on the agenda. There are a couple of reasons, of course. The Trump era, Brexit, and a worsening threat situation, which we're witnessing at the moment. But we strongly support EU-NATO cooperation because we have to benefit from both of them. The current crisis, provoked by aggressive and illegal Russian invasion, reflects a geopolitical turning point. And this, at this very moment, shows the importance and the effectiveness of EU-NATO cooperation. We stand united as EU and NATO against Russian aggression. And this unity is and should remain key in our deterrence. This war has shown that EU and NATO complement each other, strengthen each other, and this should be the way forward. Let me give you a few examples. NATO's core tasks is the collective defense and deterrence. And we rightly, it was already mentioned, we're rightly ramping up our defense of the eastern flank. But on the other hand, it's NATO financing the delivery of weapons through the 5 billion European peace facility. And we couldn't have thought about that a couple of months ago. The EU is imposing sanctions, and there's political pressure from both organizations on Russia and strong coordination between them. And all of the examples show how we strengthen each other's efforts. The Russian invasion in Ukraine also only further reiterates the need to increase the EU's ability to act in the area of security and defense, using both military and civilian instruments. Therefore, the adaptation of the strategic compass has been essential. Shift implementation, and we're already talking about this, will be important, and this will require additional investments by all of us. The EU will have to play a greater role in crisis management, particularly in its own vicinity. And the compass rightfully strengthens the conditions that will enable the EU to gradually, and I repeat gradually, to do so. Command and control, joint training, joint exercises, and joint funding, and in line with the NATO standards for interoperability. Of course, NATO's role in deterrence is unquestioned, and at the same time, the EU's combined economic power is immense, and so is the potential leverage it gives us on the world stage, for example, in imposing sanctions. But besides economic power, EU should further enhance its military capabilities. I think here of the capability of the EU to counter hybrid threats. EU has powerful tools in this regard and will improve its efforts by developing a hybrid toolbox. And I also think of the development of the rapid deployment capacity, the further strengthening of EU missions and operations effectiveness, and the further development of the MPCC. NATO, on the other hand, has harmonized standards and a clear picture of the shortfalls in capabilities and capacities. The EU has 8 billion in the EU Defence Fund, for which acts as a catalyst to stimulate defence industries to work together. At their summit in Versailles, the EU leaders tasked the European Commission President von der Leyen and the European Defence Agency to present a report in May on the defence investment gaps and to put forward proposals to close these gaps. So on the investment chapter of the compass also, things are definitely moving. Once we improve the capabilities and readiness of our armed forces, we'll make both NATO and EU stronger. In sum, a European Union that takes more responsibility for security and defense will also strengthen NATO. And as Prime Minister Mark Rutte said in a speech before the recent French-Dutch government consultations, confronted by the threat we now face, it's our solemn duty to make these two organizations that are essential to Europe even stronger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lars, you alluded to the importance of the cooperation with the EU and NATO. And indeed, there is a lot to be said about that, what works and what doesn't work, and what should work. But let's, before we start the debate, move to the last introduction, and we then move to the defense industrial side. Of course, the European Defense Technological and Industrial Base is a prerequisite for developing European military capabilities. Without it, you are dependent on others, and you cannot be dependent for everything on others. And Airbus Defence and Space is playing a very important role in that. So I would like to hear your views on how you look at the importance of the EU strategic compass, but also of the upcoming NATO strategic concept for strengthening the European defence technological and industrial base. You have the floor.
Turn it on, that's better. There we go. Bon, aussi de mon côté, j'aimerais remercier Monsieur l'ambassadeur Vassy, Madame.
In Miss Her Excellency Muriel Domenach for this invitation at a very crucial moment in the security compass. So donc
aspects of it here. And if I start looking at it on the personal view, the first element is basically, if you look at the current crisis, is basically to take never anything really for granted. And it also means that this current crisis really shows that the importance of a strong EU, what we see here. But it also needs a strong EU defense industry there, and even more, the partnerships that need to be put in place. So in general, if I look at the industrial view on the strategic compass, I think out of this particular view from the industry, I think the strategic compass is as of today the most consolidated, the most comprehensive, EU documented, translated into real terms, the concept of strategic autonomy, as we just indicated, in the defense domain. And we actually really shouldn't consider the strategic compass as an additional strategic food for thought paper. So it's not a menu. I'm fully aligned with that. It should really function as what it actually says, a compass guiding us towards the right direction. And it should guide us basically looking at where we should plan the investments. The document itself is providing strong arguments and tentative tools to counter the risks of seeing most of the increasing military budget directed to non-EU equipment or to purely national ones. The question is it enough? A couple of remarks, 3. The strategic autonomy is really high on the political agenda. We see it. We see the concrete development of these new EU policies. I was just looking at it, and there's a couple of them. The EU cyber defense policy by 22. EU space strategy for security and defense by end of 23. It's all very quickly. Strengthen EU's own intelligence capacities via the EU single intelligence analysis capacity. Strengthen the EU satellite center for autonomous geospatial intelligence by 25. We need to have satellites up by 25. If we need to still make them, we need to go fast. The actions actually should be focused at creating autonomy of the EU, complementary to our transatlantic partnerships. Today, we think on the industrial side, we're too dependent on US technologies. Cooperation is good, but dependency is not. And then going beyond strategic autonomy, I think we should also start to look at strategic industrial policy. And it's not a given in many European countries. Courage from some government is needed to support the industry, also financially. More EU alignment or vision is necessary on strategic industrial policy without creating the new independencies. Or is it time for an EU strategic industrial policy? This will require some nations to step out of their shadows. The second point is really looking at what we've mentioned before, the increase of investments. Up to NATO level, as we see, or just below, in defense are finally taking place. It's a very clear initiative also, the compass here, to see the increased defense budget and further improve also the efficiency of the defense spendings. An elaborate analysis of defense investment gaps to be made by May 22, again, very quick. More transparent and An emulative exchange on national defense spending levels and objectives will be organized. Also, this transparency is very good also for the industrial side to see. And then several financial incentives to encourage collaborative investments, VAT waiver, the EDF bonus, a lot of instruments are being indicated already there. And the common funding of the EU military missions will be increased and will be built in a more consolidated way. Hence, it is really important to work together. I talked about the partnership with the industry and the different governments, but we need to make the right choices and have our priorities really clear. For example, on the autonomous communication and navigation systems, we are there already with Galileo, but also the multinational concepts like the MRTT fleet. I visited Eindhoven base last week to see how in these activities, nationalities really don't matter, and it's a fully international force. But we also should look, and we've been reminded from a couple of sides, we need to have an independent European launcher capability. Cyber activities definitely to be further improved, and I think we can do another big step on joint trainings. The support of the development of the technologies to create technological independency should lead also to more uniformity of defense systems in Europe. I think we should use the momentum and prevent bureaucracy in order to be able to quickly act and react. And another element, I would encourage launching customership to be encouraged. Last point is really that I think it's important to have a vision on the long-term view of a few topics that are pillars for this strategic autonomy. We've seen in the EU already the EU Chips Act. But I think we should step further and look at, let's say, the future combat air systems, counter UAV. And as indicated, space is becoming more and more a defense domain that requires more attention. We can think about, let's say, more secure communication systems, laser SATCOM, SSA, and again, what I indicated before, the European independent access to space. So to finalize my speech here is basically, I think we should be able to take benefit of the crisis, the current crisis context, to propose a more integrated undertakings and to force decisions. I think the expected proposals by mid-May will be key, and I'm sure will be supported by the entire industrial footprint. Thanks.
Rob, that concludes the introductory statements. I'd like to make use of my prerogative as a moderator to ask one or two questions and go back to the panel, and then we open up the debate for the audience. I think we've heard a lot about reinforcing Article 5 collective defense of NATO, which after the Ukraine war is even more needed, I think, than before. We heard about the EU and its crisis management tasks. But I'd like to explore a little bit more in the panel the issue of hybrid threats and how we deal with that, because it seems to be that it's not very clear where there is a dividing line between what NATO should do and what the EU should do. And in the third place, of course, and last but not least, I would say what the member states have to do. So I would like to pose the question to all of you, how you see this from a NATO and an EU perspective or a national perspective. What is the role of member states? What is the role of NATO? What is the role of the European Union? There is this hybrid toolbox mentioned in the compass, but it all still has to be developed. A couple of elements are mentioned in the compass. So that is my first question, and you can pick and choose what you want to answer. The other one I like to raise, nobody of you mentioned Article 42.7 of the EU Treaty, which has been brought to the fore, in particularly by non-NATO EU members in the last few weeks because of the Ukraine crisis. I think Sweden and Finland in particular, and giving Article 42.7 a more prominent place in the compass. And again, there is the issue, where is sort of the dividing line between Article 5 NATO, collective defense, and 42.7 in particularly in the hybrid area. So those are my two questions. They are interrelated. Pick and choose as you like. And I think I might follow the same order as we had the introduction. So I'll start with you, Ambassador Domenach. Okay, then are you ready to start, Jaap?
Hello? Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, it's a good point. The latter point, Article 5 and Article 42.7, obviously is of a maybe of an academic nature to a certain extent. And obviously we have to see in what situations member states or allies would invoke these articles to be helped by their fellow member states and allies, and then we would see how it actually works. In fact, we've had exercises, tabletop exercises on how to go about it and how that would work. Basically, it would be triggering negotiations or talks amongst ourselves in order to see what measures are needed to confront a threat coming from outside. For instance, indeed, a cyber threat. And on that cyber, when you say cyber, you say a bit hybrid as well. It is correlated. To be honest, I don't know the definition of hybrid. It's a bit of everything. Usually non-military, non-kinetic. In cyberspace, we also mention it in when we talk about information and disinformation. We talk about other threats that we need to face, maybe energy blackmail, issues like that we're talking about. And we have to sort out once one of these articles is invoked, what measures we could take against, and the toolbox is geared at developing these instruments, making quick procedures to actually prepare them and to put them in place so that they can be used, and to agree on that. But it's, I think the challenge, but also the secret of its success is in exercising, is in practicing, and see how these things work out in practice. Well, you can find many scenarios and blueprints for types of crises, and you can exercise them. And I think that's the best way to go about it. So that would be my provisional answer to your question, Dick.
Maybe before I give you the floor, ask the military point of view, just from your perspective, and then you can get the floor.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. First on hybrid. Indeed, the question is, what do we understand when we are talking about hybrid? And looking now from a military perspective on it, my impression was from time to time when we have discussed that in the EU environment, in the making of the strategic compass, that the one or the other understood hybrid as everything which is not military. I would say this is wrong. I mean, regularly hybrid is understood as the utilization of different means of power, so for the same objective. And the military normally is one of them. And I would argue that most of the hybrid actions we have seen in the world, including in Ukraine, includes also the military tool somehow. Maybe as something which is very much in the background, but it is there as something which is very much deterrent, for example. So the military should be included in whatever the hybrid toolbox will be in the end. This is still under discussion and under development, but we are very much arguing for including us. Also, as it is very important for military always to prepare for that. And it has been mentioned that exercising is key, and for the military even more. So that would be my take on the hybrid toolbox 42.7 related to that. But from a EU institutional perspective, I can lay back. 42.7 is something between member states, and member states are very much highlighting this also, rightly so. That is the legal background. However, there is, based on the French experiences, kind of manual already submitted to member states. And also that, I think we need again and again exercise and then putting the things together.
En français ou en anglais? Français ou en anglais? Bon, d'accord. Ok. Hybrid in Article 5, Article 42.7. Hybrid would be the perfect case for a codification. Is that an English word? Codification of EU-NATO cooperation. Yet, while in the real world, a lot is being done on the EU side, and NATO is clearly appreciative of what's done on the EU side with the disinformation center, the cyber defense, resilience, a lot of what's being done at the EU is highly valued at NATO, yet, and we have to face realities at some point, it proved impossible to this day to acknowledge the level of cooperation we're having, because it raises issues that have been known for decades when it comes to NATO-EU cooperation, and basically the Turkey-Cyprus issues. And at some point, those of us that have been, supportive of NATO-EU cooperation have to at some point realize that it's going to be maybe opposite to how we usually proceed. It might be doing more than anything we acknowledge. So while politicians would have la tendance inverse, c'est-à-dire d'annoncer avant de faire.
So look,
we've been doing a lot.
Sometimes people
be having any formal framework to that. So that's with a hybrid. Again, the reality is cooperation has been unprecedented, yet informal, and including in the Ukraine context. La deuxième chose, donc l'article 5 et l'article 40.
Now, the second question that was asked of me, the Article 5 and Article 42.7, we had some questions there with Sweden and Finland. And I think those of us who are both members of the European Union and of NATO, we have commitments that are the same as 42.7 and 5. Naturally, the conditions in the real world are often not the same, and naturally also with inclusion or not of the United States. I think at present we can see that the United States have a strong commitment for collective defense. So the question of Articles 5 and Article 42.7, it has to do with mutual reinforcement and the need of Europeans to think of their own defense, what we call intellectual and moral rearmament in Paris. So once again, we don't want to think the security of Europe against that of the United States. And I really want to insist on the fact that no one in Paris is trying to remove the United States from European security. On the contrary, we are perfectly aware of the reality. We believe that asking Europeans to think of their own security is not saying to the Americans, you can leave. On the contrary, it is to show the Americans, look, you can count on us. As my children say, you know, we're big, we're big. Or at least we are aware of our responsibilities and we're not thinking the world without you and definitely not against you, but side by side with you. So for the hybrid, we have a collaboration that exists between NATO and the EU, but it's informal. You don't really find it in the text. And, you know, for the rest, a real call to rethink the world.
Rob, if they want to add something on this question, Lars first.
Maybe a bit provocative, but aren't these both very theoretical questions we have on the table? Hybrids, it has many forms, from purely military, cyber, disinfo. I think there are a lot of solutions, but I think like a hybrid toolbox, when can we use one solution? I think that's the main question that's on the table. Again, and how? Does it work now? Loud voice it is. Okay, now it is. Thank you, Jaap. Close cooperation. Now, there are many solutions, there are many procedures already, but how to bring them together at the right moment, at the right time. And sometimes there's a bit of pressure or a bit of outside, well, events needed. As we see in Ukraine crisis, NATO cooperation, EU cooperation has never been so close as it is now. I think the same for Article 5, Article 42.7, and many has been said, and many things have been written already about it. But in the end, it has to work in practice. So that's what we should do. Do table talk exercises, do exercises where we can see, do we understand each other? Where do we complement each other? What are the differences? And how does this work? So let's be practical on both of these issues. Thank you.
Yeah, a small remark specifically on hybrid tools. I think what is important probably when we talk is to exactly define what we're talking about. We mentioned cyber, we mentioned disinformation, and we think it's on the defense side. So, or no, I mean, that's what I wanted to say. Let's say from the industry, typically I think the first reflex would be to look at the defense side, basically, because what you see, as soon as you see hybrid, it goes beyond the borders that we see now on the map just before. Hybrid goes beyond, and it's really focusing on other entities which are being, let's say, dragged into a situation whereby definitely the defense side is an important one. It's not only the industry. I think the industry is pretty much, let's say, geared up for a number of years now on this. But yeah, I think the most important one, which is probably not, let's say, fully, I think, still understood when we talk about, let's say, the hybrid toolbox even, it's the effect that it has beyond, let's say, the borders that we are actually looking at now.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's now time for you to raise your hand and ask a question. If you do so, please very shortly introduce who you are, and please, no long statements, but very clear, short, crisp questions, because of course we have used a bit more time than planned, but I think you heard quite a rich number of statements and answers to my questions so far. So that is giving you some food for thought. What I would like to do is take 2 or 3 questions, and then the members of the panel can choose the question which they want to answer as they like. So who wants to please raise your hand. I see somebody at the back. Microphone will be brought to you, so wait a moment, please.
Merci. Un grand merci pour cette table ronde très intéressante. Je m'appelle Isabelle Duivenstein et je suis professeure à l'université de Leiden dans les études internationales.
Can you switch the microphone on, because I don't think it's working.
Allumez le microphone, s'il vous plaît, madame. Je pense pas qu'il soit allumé.
I'll talk louder.
Okay.
I have 3 quick questions. First of all, we are talking about a strategic compass. I understand the compass to be an instrument that you take along when you enter uncharted territory, but you have an idea where you want to go. What I miss in the strategic compass is an idea about destination. On the opening page, I was happy to reread it just yesterday. It says it's going to focus on interests. I would love to hear the panel on where they think the destination lies. So where do we want to get at with this strategic compass? My second question, I'm going to be a little greedy. I've got a third one lined up. It's a rather academic one, since I'm an academic. I was wondering in particular in relation to the methods that the strategic compass identifies, whether there's any consideration or in particular reconsideration of the methods that we're aiming to use. What I'm getting at is, to what extent are the methods in the strategic compass actually evidence-based? And I came across very interesting concepts like technological sovereignty, resilience is a buzzword, but also the comprehensive approach shines through the text. To what extent is there evidence to support all these methods? We have been trying to promote democracy for the last 3 decades. The results are not very hopeful. My last point is, to what extent are there considerations regarding path dependencies? Because we're operating under high pressure at the moment. We are facing a conflict in Europe. We're taking lots of important steps currently. Are we actually considering second and third order effects of all these things that are happening now? So what are the consequences, and are we giving enough attention to those potential consequences of these momentous steps we're taking? Thank you so much in advance for answering.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Yes, over there.
Hello, my name is Sim. I am part of the Dutch United Nations Student Association. My question is, if there is a future crisis in which the tools that are now developed are being used, what ideas are there to prevent outside forces from playing European politics against each other and preventing the tools that are being developed now from being put to use in the first place?
Thank you very much. It is about the tools of crisis management, I think. Is there another request for the floor? Not for the moment. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Jan Blakjere, Dutch Defense. I just have a question for you, Madam. Et je peux la poser en français.
The question in French. You have spoken about security guarantees, mostly of NATO, but we also spoke about Articles 5 and 42.7 recently. And maybe to complicate the situation even more, there are countries that give, bilateral guarantees, for instance, Poland, Turkey. Don't you think that if there were to be a future crisis of this type, that NATO would necessarily be involved?
Okay, let's have a little break here to go back to the panel. We come back for a second round. So we have a couple of questions. I think the question on what is the compass for in terms of what should it aimed at in terms of destination was interesting. The dependency question no doubt will raise some reactions from our industrial representative, but others may also respond. Crisis management tools, and then the issue of not only Article 5 and 42.7, but also bilateral agreements with security or defense guarantees. Who wants to answer first? Lars, yeah, go ahead. Yep.
And I hope it works, and it does. Well, first of all, about the first question, having been a navigator on board Navy ships, you don't only use your compass for unnavigated waters, you regularly use it to reach your destination, even it's already known. When it comes to the EU strategic compass, I think it's no surprise that the EU economically, and I said so already, is a major power in the world. But when we look at the military capabilities of the EU, they're almost non-existent. So I think there's a clear goal to not only become a economic power, but also a military power. And in reaching that goal, ultimately, I guess we're also a more equal partner to the United States within NATO, because I think that's what we've always been counting on, and rightly so, I think. But I think to have discussions on an equal level, we as Europeans should step up as well to be able to protect ourselves, not collectively and like in collective defense, but we should be able to do things militarily, and we should be an equal partner to have serious discussions between equal partners. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Who else wants to respond? Jaap, please.
Thank you. Yes. Well, to the professor from Leiden, I almost wanted to say about the destination that maybe the journey is the destination, but that would be too easy. Actually, that answer doesn't actually satisfy myself completely. But I think it's what Lars says. It's for the protection and promotion of our interests, but also of our values and of our democratic values, of our economic prosperity, and basically of our way of life. And I think what we see around us, not only coming from Russia and Ukraine, for that matter, but also from other corners. That is a destination. The preservation of all of that is a destination or a goal, a target that is under stress and is being challenged, and that is worth preparing ourselves for and defending ourselves for. On the methods, evidence-based. It's an interesting thought and an interesting contribution to the discussion. To be honest, I've never looked at it this way. The strategic compass is a piece of strategic communication. It's not a scientific piece of work. In the strategic compass, we say what we see around us. We say who we are and how we want to promote, to defend ourselves and to promote our interest for ourselves in a circle around us, basically. I'm interested in actually your view on the evidence-based principles there. I think resilience is not so much an evidence-based thing. It is something that you stand for and you want to promote, you want to increase, because we conceive challenges that are more serious than before. But I'd like to continue that discussion. I'm interested in it because in the end, we need to have a compass, and if we deliver on the compass on the various tracks in 5 or 10 years, indeed, we need to have something that we can show for and that we can prove to be worthy and to be useful. On past dependencies and second and third order effects, I'm sorry, jetzt bin ich überfragt. But perhaps you could say a little bit more what you mean by that. But I think Lars already said something on that. The EU played against each other from the Students' Association. I would like to say, I think what we see now with this crisis on our hands, what we see is an extreme form, a positive form of EU unity and EU-NATO unity for that matter, which makes me believe whether Article 5 or Article 42.7 are invoked or not, that whenever we come under stress, we see us very much clinging to each other. That's a very positive experience, I must say, and it is. It's been very hard work in the past few weeks and months, I must say, not only for the compass, but also on Russia, Ukraine, both at NATO, I'm sure, and with us in PSC. But the sense of unity and of common goal and achievement has never been greater, I think. And so if you come against us, rest assured that you will get a unified response. Many differences evaporate and disappear in the face of a threat, and that's very good to know. So I think there's nothing better than EU unity in that respect.
To Ambassador Domenach, in particular, the question about the multilateral agreements in NATO and the EU versus bilateral security assistance agreements.
So your question was connected to the Ukraine crisis, or?
Countries will give their guarantees bilaterally to Ukraine in case of a new attack, for instance.
Okay,
so
d'accord, je
what
vois.
will be the implies this kind of in-between concept.
Okay. Oui. La question des garanties de
The question of security guarantees that is raised by Ukraine is legitimate. It's a political process that is moving forward, but it is difficult, especially in the current context, after the atrocities discovered in Busha. So the bilateral discussion continues to move forward. It is encouraged by several third parties, including France, by the way, Germany also, Turkey. And in this context, several questions are put on the table. Of course, the one of Ukraine's status, also the question of the degree of militarization of Ukraine, the territorial question, and also the question of the security guarantees. So once again, this question by Ukraine is legitimate. Ukraine has been aggressed twice. It has already had the guarantees, 1995, the Memorandum of Budapest, but these were negative security guarantees. So, well, they've been violated. So it's understandable that Ukraine wants positive security guarantees. Well, how can these be granted without membership of NATO? Because it seems that the Ukraine authorities themselves have put forward the idea of the neutrality of Ukraine. So how can you therefore word positive security guarantees without NATO membership? Naturally, this is a very complex discussion, and in this context, the two parties will naturally
it's difficult right now that Russia will accept NATO as a guarantor. You see, so the issue of security guarantees will be raised on the part of a certain number of third parties, but I would say that for the moment, unfortunately, we do not see any advances in our political inclusion, and it seems that the context that we are discovering makes things more painful and more difficult than we expected. But you're right, of course, it's a difficult question to face.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the questions. I mean, they were very political. Yeah, so I don't think I can add really much from a military perspective, but I would like to maybe highlight that the strategic compass is not the only document we have, and there is still the global strategy, which was, I would say, more generic, and gave quite good, in my opinion, destination, but also in the strategic compass. This is, I think it's a typical kind of strategy with ends, ways, means considerations, and there are a lot of political ends in it if you read it. That is my take as a military. It's offering to us, as one of the main political instruments, the military, a lot of clear political ends, political destinations, if you will.
Yeah, I can only on the compass, I can only, let's say, link in with what we just said before. It provides a strategy, and I indicated from the industrial perspective, it's one of the most clear elements towards strategic autonomy, where you definitely see that also on the industrial side, you see what are the steps going ahead. Again, it's a compass, so we don't know where exactly it will lead, but I think it's a very clear vision towards, let's say, the support where the industry can definitely provide assistance. On the past dependencies, I think it's an interesting question. It's not only the last element, we've seen it over the last couple of years, what dependency does also from the industrial perspective. We just mentioned China in your presentation. We've seen already what that really happens on what the impact is on the daily lives. I think even more impact on industrial chains. And what we've seen during the recent events, again, another effect of dependencies, whether it's with Russia, whether it's with Ukraine, is clearly something that we need to take into consideration. Working quite a lot in the space sector, I think one of the areas which had been so far been looked at as being sacred, well above, let's say, all the terrestrial problematics. Also there now we see that the tension is there, and on that particular point, interdependency is crucial. So if that starts to fail, yeah, then we need to really look at, let's say, how we would like to be dependent.
As you said in your introduction, there's a great deal to be done here in civil-military cooperation with Galileo, Copernicus, and so forth. I'm looking at Ambassador Vassy, if we are allowed to do one final round, or do we want to conclude? Okay, excellent. We'll have a final round of questions, and it starts with Ambassador Vassy. S'il vous plaît.
One, two, yeah. So maybe just a little, very small comment, if you allow me, and then my real question. The comment is more on Article 42.7. As Muriel and some others know, I was actually in the room when we triggered the Article 42.7 for the first and only time after the attacks against the Bataclan, the terrorist attacks in Paris. In a sense, I think what we saw is that there is a security commitment, first of all, within the European Union. It's very clearly enshrined in the texts, and it's also true that I feel the debate between Article 5 and 42.7 is in fact pretty theoretical. By the way, we were asked at the time, why not Article 5? And our answer, frankly, was very political. We said, well, the solidarity from North America is already there. The US have already committed resources to help us in the Sahel, and same to a very large extent to Canada. So what we need is to mobilize the Europeans. So 42.7 for that is more efficient in a way. And I don't see any instance right now, because we are more and more an integrated political body within the European Union. I don't see an instance where full-fledged aggression against one European member would not be met with solidarity by other member states, even if it's not a NATO member. I mean, it goes without saying that we will be side by side with other Europeans, because that's what we are, or the whole political project will be at stake. So we'll be confronted with that choice, and it's more a political choice than really a legal choice, if you will. My question, and I'm really going to be the devil's advocate here, is about the European organization, well, let's say, when it comes to security issues. I think for a long time, we've, let's say, I would say very pro-NATO European countries, I don't like the expression, but I don't have a better one right now in the top of my head, would say, look, security is for NATO, and economic issues, other issues are for the EU. What we see with the current crisis is the revelation of something we already knew, of course, which is that security is everywhere. Food security. We see Russia threatening countries not to send them wheat if they don't comply with what they want. Energy security. I think we've been reminded that energy is clearly a security issue. Value chains, chips, semiconductors. I mean, security is frankly everywhere. So the idea that you can separate the two is not only false, but as I see it, is actually a problem, because it doesn't allow you to efficiently cope with escalation issues. If you have disregarded that security is in fact everywhere, you find yourself in a situation where you cannot manage with the full spectrum of your leverage, the aggression when it comes from a different place, typically energy, food, etc. And in fact, for these issues, the EU is much better tool than anyone else. I mean, look at food. Food is frankly very much an issue that we've been managing together. So it's clear that food security will be an EU issue, mostly. Energy, obviously. Supply chains, we have the CHIPS Act coming out. So in fact, so my question is, how do we make sure that the security philosophy or the understanding that security issues are in fact everywhere really trickles down the whole EU institutional system, which has been built, to be honest, with the idea that security issues shouldn't be actually part of the EU because these issues were dealt with somewhere else, which in fact proves to be not only wrong, but counterproductive to a very large extent, as I see it. Sorry, I've been a bit long.
Oops, sorry, I was given a mic at the same time. Thank you. I'm Mallory, one of the junior officers here for the embassy, and several panelists mentioned the military planning and conduct capability as one of the key components of the command and control for the EU. And I was wondering, in light of the strategic compass, giving it a broader role, this was mentioned, do you see it maybe on the long term becoming a European counterparts to shape, or is this delusional? Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to the embassy for inviting us. Thank you very much. And to the members of the panel for being here and talking with us. My name is Vasilis, and I am the president of ISA, which is the student association for the International Relations Masters at Leiden University. So, hi, Professor, also. My question is twofold. Maybe I have two separate questions. The first one, I don't know if anyone, both are directed at anyone and everyone who would like to answer. I'm not sure you would be very eager to respond to the first one, but we have been talking about external military threats, but that kind of reminds me of the specter floating above Europe. But what threats are we actually talking about? Is there a name to these threats? Because I'm sure in your minds, you're all thinking of something, but what is the threat that we want to protect ourselves from? And in addition, I have a second one. Given Europe's history, do you think maybe other countries, other regions should be developing military alliances to protect themselves from us? In the same sense, don't you think that further military integration in Europe is bound to bring to result in a chain reaction with other regions engaging in similar actions, thereby creating a new kind of Cold War atmosphere in the world? How is that going to be prevented? Thank you.
A lot. Thanks also for the really comprehensive questions. I start with the MPCC. This is, and I think probably it will never be something like SHAPE. The level of ambition of NATO is quite higher. There is a fully fledged command structure subordinate to SHAPE. That is something different, really. The MPCC will hopefully develop to a single command, Brussels based on the military strategy, on the military strategic level. But below that, we will always see national forces and headquarters, and the scope of military operations and missions of the European Union will never be, let's see, for the foreseeable future at least, like they are for NATO. So I don't see any competition there, and I would also like to reject those kind of concerns that we are duplicating here, maybe something like SHAPE. So that was on the MPCC. On the threats, I mean, these are, maybe I should state that for the first time ever, as a preparation of the works on the strategic compass, the EU has conducted and developed a threat analysis. So the threats were clearly identified and ranging from real territorial defense issues through the crisis management to terrorism. So you name it. Yeah. So, but they are clearly identified, and they are constituting the basis for everything else which has been developed and negotiated in the strategic compass. And the world we face, the first chapter, is predominantly, let's say, an outline of this threat analysis. Yeah, and on Mr. Ambassador's question on the how we get everything together, I mean, this is more political, but I would simply make the point that is exactly what the integrated approach is about. And what we see is that the Commission is more and more being active in the field of security and defense, and I would say, personal view, rightly so, they have a big role. But indeed, the question really is how we get the things even better together in order to make the integrated approach really a success. Yeah. So what we see at many places is that we are still, I would say, lacking the best utilization of our instruments that could be possible.
Thank you, Lars. I won't start a debate on treaty change, because I think there are elements the treaty is posing to answer the question of the ambassador, and I think the previous and the current Commission are trying their utmost to reach the limits of the treaties, but there are of course problems there. But I'm not participating in the debate, I have to moderate, so I'll refrain from further comments. Rob, you have the floor.
Yes. No, I'll be very brief and basically responding to Mr. the Ambassador. I think, let's say from the industrial perspective, definitely, I think guidelines also on the security aspect are coming from the EU, not from NATO. So I think we see the increased importance, let's say, of the clarity of the regulations on this. But it's clearly how difficult it is if you would open the debate on energy and what to do in what country. It's not for tomorrow that we'll have, let's say, a unified vision on that.
Je vais répondre à la question
question of the gentleman's question. Who is the enemy? I'll answer in a spontaneous way, as if I was speaking to my son. So the enemy is, first of all, those who consider us as enemies. And there we, in our generation, and when I'm speaking about our generation, I'm speaking about the generation that reached political awareness after the end of the Cold War. When I was 16 years old, I went to Berlin when the wall came down. And then when I was your age, I studied the end of history and the age of perpetual democracy by Fukuyama. And today we notice that democracy did not win everywhere and forever. So there is really in the world people who consider us as their enemies. And the fact is that Russia's actions, Russia's attack are a threat for us. So I would say, first of all, that yes, Russia, indeed. And that does not mean that we have to be fighting a war against Russia. In fact, our alliance at NATO are defensive alliances in their essence. We have no offensive ambitions. So we have to look at things in a realistic way. Of course, yes, indeed, Russia's attack, Russia's actions are aggressive and therefore threatening. Second of all, terrorism, and in particular, Islamist terrorism. Here, I'm making this difference between the external threat that you brought up and the internal threat that it's a fact that we have because of our common action reduced the sanctuaries that ISIS or other terrorist groups were using. This is necessary to prevent the reconstitution of a command capacity and a control capacity that may trigger attacks such as what we experienced in Paris in the Bataclan. So we also, and more, see an internal terrorist threat that is inspired by local groups, then commanded from the outside. And in order to fight efficiently against this internal threat, I think that we have to accept that we should have a societal conversation that we should develop among ourselves with regard to the values that we wish to defend, but also integrate this conversation in our foreign policy. And I would like to underline that we also have, and more, we're facing more and more an internal threat from extreme right terrorist groups. And this internal threat is taking advantage of the polarization taking advantage of polarization developed by the Islamic terrorism. And third, we have a Chinese challenge. China is not a threat, China is not our enemy, but its action, its coercion, its forceful action is a threat for us. And in the interest of your generation and in the interest of our children, we have to deal with this challenge. We have to work on our sovereignty, on our autonomy, and on our technological autonomy. We have to accept that there are contested areas in space, for example, in particular cyberspace. So we have to strengthen ourselves so that we are not subjected to more coercion. So to get back to what I was saying as a conclusion earlier, I would like to say that for your generation, it's not obvious that we are the good guys. And that it's not enough to say that we're the good guys, that we're European and whatever, or Western, in order to convince But I would like once again to underline, to stress a point. Our interest, our common interest, is to defend in Europe the rule of law rather than the might of law, rather than the right of law, rather than the right of might. It's your interest to defend the power of law, the power of law. Otherwise, it will be a jungle.
Yes, thank you very much. I couldn't agree more than with the last sentences that you spoke. To the ambassador, I would like to say security, between security for Europe and our economic power, the thing that connects it to is sanctions. And sanctions we have used with success, I tend to believe, against Russia. Apart from that, I think the EU, you say the EU is a better tool. I agree, yes and no. Yes, I agree, because I think we have been successful in devising sanctions that really hurt Russia, not only ourselves, also ourselves. True sanctions also hurt ourselves. That's the definition of sanction. It's something you inflict on somebody else, but also at the same time you inflict pain on yourself. But that's part of the procedure. Apart from that, apart from this, the sanctions packages, we've also, as an EU institutionally, we have facilitated through the European Peace Facility also arms deliveries to Ukraine, to help them with their self-defense, and we've also provided a clearinghouse to coordinate, or at least to be clear on what and how and when and where. And I think, therefore, the EU has been of institutional significance to the crisis Russia-Ukraine. If you say a better tool, then implicitly you compare with something else. If this were NATO, I would say no, EU is not necessarily a better tool than NATO. It's a different tool in a different toolbox. NATO is about collective security and a collective self-defense. And I think NATO has woken up to the aggression, to Russian aggression, by securing our territorial integrity furthermore and proactively defend it in a stronger way. That's what NATO is supposed to do. I think it's doing it in the right way. It does not compare to the EU sanctions and what I mentioned on arms deliveries and EPF. And when you mentioned EU and NATO, I was also wondering where has the OSCE gone? The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Helsinki process. I mean, this was the forum where we were supposed to engage with Russia, Belarus, and others, and everyone, also transatlantic. Where has it gone? Where has the era of cooperative security gone after this invasion? And looking towards the future, and I invite you all to come up with ideas on that, also the think tanks, Dick. I mean, how are we going to fit in Russia after this war into a secure European security context that really works? It has to have its proper place. Will it be a bigger place because it demands more and it shows it's able and willing to use force in order to make its place felt to us as well, or whether it would be a smaller place because it may be losing the war, and that we should subject them to the principles, the Helsinki principles, and the principles of inclusiveness, of free choice, and of cooperative security. I think we should have a good look at that, but maybe it's too soon because we do not know how this war ends. To Vasilis, I would like to say, I think Lars on that side already gave a reply, and the ambassador as well, to what threats are there still. I found your question interesting. To whom are we a threat? Europe, that is. Let me confine ourselves to Europe. I don't think Europe is a military threat to anyone. And I mean it honestly, with a hand on my heart. I don't think we have any offensive ideas. But I do believe I could understand that we are perceived as an economic threat to some, maybe because of competitive advantages that we may have. But certainly we are seen to some as a threat because of our values, our value system, democracy, human rights, etc. And again, that is a possession. I think there's no worse threat to autocracies than the model that we have and our willingness to export this model. We are very value-driven. I mean, we already spoke about this. NATO is a very value-driven. The EU is a very value-driven organization. And the outside world better be aware that this is what we want to export to the rest of the world. And we think we do that for the good. We're convinced of that. But obviously, from the other side, it can be, especially in autocratic regime, can be seen as I don't know, moral imperialism or whatever you would whatever label you would put to it. Should they join forces? Because that was your question, I think, Vassy. Should they form alliances against us? Rather not, I would say. And we have a situation at hand now. Obviously, the relationship between Russia and China after the invasion or around the invasion is a very important one. It's not to our it would not be to our advantage if Russia and China would gang up together against the values that the EU, Europe, and the West intends to protect. So yes, we have a situation there, to be honest, and that brings me to the point that the thing that you mentioned, Cold War. And only 2 months ago, before the invasion, I was thinking by myself, are we not, with respect to China, actually, Ambassador, thank you for raising China twice, because it is a very much an existential situation that we're in with China. We just had an EU-China summit for that matter on the 1st of April. And in that summit, we want basically China to take sides against Russia and in favor of the international legal system, in favor of the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity that we all stand for, and particularly also China stands for that. Think of Taiwan for one reason. So we want to have them on their side and also obviously support the sanctions, or at least not undermine the sanctions. So there is a struggle there going on between three of us, so to say, the three sides of this. But I wanted to say that 2 months ago, China, are we not framing China too much in Cold War terms? And were we not in the process of actually superseding Russia with China in a new Cold War sort of time of frame and rhetorics and everything? The EU has a multi-layered strategy with respect to China. One is of cooperation partner. The other one is of economic competitor. And the third one is of systemic rival. And we see in the last months and years, we see China moving more to the systemic rival type of part of the approach, so to say, and we're finding it more and more difficult to enhance the cooperative partner relationship with China. So we are in flux. We are in a situation. The Russia invasion does not help. Makes it more difficult. So these are good points, and I thank you for raising them. Although maybe this was not exactly the answer you were expecting to get, but the questions were interesting enough. Thank you.
can be very short after all these answers already given. Security is everywhere, and I think we're learning, and we're learning fast. Not only within the institutions, of which UN hasn't been mentioned at all, I think. But this is something that is in the EU, of course, but it's also national, I think. A lot of discussions internally, economic affairs, foreign affairs, defense. I think the different interests are changing, and we're adapting to it. Strategic compass, the concept, the NATO concept is not mentioning China, seeing Russia as a friend. Well, I haven't seen any text yet, but I think it's different in the new version that will see the light somewhere in June. So there's a lot of change ongoing, and people start to realize, and awareness is rising, I think. Thank you.
It's already an excellent summary that a lot is going on and a lot is changing. There is a difference between a president, a chairman, and a moderator. A president or a chairman has to conclude the debate, and a moderator doesn't have to do that. So my task is extremely easy. I want to thank all the 5 panel members for their contributions and have your applause for them. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Ambassador Vassy and his staff again for the hospitality and the excellent arrangements we had in cooperating with the Clingendael Institute. And this brings the session to an end. Thank you very much.